It began not with the roar of engines or the thunder of artillery, but with something far quieter: silence. In the early hours of August 7, 1944, as the first waves of German armor pushed toward Mortain in Hitler's desperate attempt to cut the American lines and reach Avranches, communications officers of the Wehrmacht crouched over their AM receivers and transmitters, waiting for orders, updates, and confirmations. What they heard instead was static. Interference crackled across the torn Fu.2 sets, signals faded behind the Bocage ridgelines, and units that were supposed to coordinate the armored thrust found themselves calling into a void. To the German infantry and panzer crews, the attack seemed to be unfolding as planned. To the German communications officers, the men who lived and died on the reliability of radio, the disaster had already begun. At that same moment, American infantry platoons on the receiving end of the attack reached for a device the Germans had never encountered in combat: the SCR-300 FM backpack radio. When its operator pressed the handset, the voice that emerged on the other end was clear, steady, unbroken by terrain or atmospheric distortion. There was no static, no fading, no interference. In a battlefield defined by hills, hedgerows, and dense foliage, the U.S. Signal Corps had brought something revolutionary: FM communications, frequency modulation, the first used by any army in the world for tactical infantry coordination. And as the sun rose over Normandy, this superiority in communications would shape the battle more decisively than any tank duel or infantry advance. German signals troops had long prided themselves on discipline and technical competence. The Wehrmacht's communications doctrine was built on careful planning, layered command nets, and the assumption that radio, though imperfect, could stitch together the combined arms of blitzkrieg. But that doctrine had been forged on the plains of Poland and France, in the open steppes of Russia, where line-of-sight transmission allowed AM sets to function adequately. Normandy was different. The Bocage country, with its earthen walls and thick tree lines, absorbed and distorted AM signals. Commands meant for a battalion arrived faintly or not at all. Platoons assaulted targets without knowing whether the neighboring unit had begun its advance. A Panzer Grenadier company at Mortain discovered too late that it had pushed far ahead of its supporting tanks, not because of enemy action, but because their radio call for coordination had never gotten through. Meanwhile, the SCR-300, designed by Motorola and fielded in 1943, cut effortlessly through the battlefield's chaos. Its FM signal ignored atmospheric static, resisted interference from German transmitters, and maintained clarity even when operators moved behind hills or thick forests. It provided a stable communications link between infantry platoons, company command posts, artillery observers, and armored units. What made it lethal was not the radio itself, but what it enabled. Every American unit could call artillery with speed and accuracy. Every forward observer could update coordinates in real time. Every company commander could maneuver under fire while still maintaining control of his formation. In a battle as fluid and chaotic as Mortain, communications meant survival. German signals officers quickly realized they were losing a war they had never prepared for: the war of battlefield information. Their AM radios, susceptible to atmospheric noise and enemy jamming, faltered at the very moment precise communication was needed most. Several panzer commanders reported hearing American artillery shells falling behind them before they received orders about the change in German assault direction. The Americans were coordinating fire missions within minutes. The Germans were still waiting for replies. As the attack bogged down, more radios went silent, not because American interference blocked them, but because the German network had collapsed under terrain and strain. This collapse was not confined to Normandy. In the Hurtgen Forest, perhaps the most unforgiving terrain on the Western Front, German units found their radios nearly useless. Trees, moisture, elevation changes, everything that killed AM signals flourished in Hurtgen's dark labyrinth. Entire German battalions fought for days without reliable contact with their regiments. Patrols became isolated, counterattacks failed to synchronize. Artillery support, vital in close terrain, often did not arrive because the request never reached the correct headquarters. American units in the same forest, battered and bloodied as they were, still maintained functional coordination. SCR-300 operators relayed enemy positions, requested fire missions, and reported unit strength with clarity that astonished POWs captured later. And even before American cryptalysis or code breaking entered the picture, the Germans understood that something deeper was happening. They were not simply experiencing interference, they were experiencing technological obsolescence, a battlefield reality in which the U.S. Army possessed a communications network that could not be matched, hacked, or disrupted by German means. Their war machine depended on synchronization. Their synchronization was dissolving. By late 1944, German commanders began including alarming notes in their battle diaries. One entry from the 2nd Panzer Division's signals officer complained, "American communications are constant, ours are uncertain." Another from a Volksgrenadier regiment near Schmidt stated, "We cannot fight what we cannot coordinate." And the Americans, learning quickly from success, pushed their advantage. They expanded the number of FM sets per battalion. They trained artillery observers to move with frontline infantry. They positioned signal intercept units to track German AM transmissions, easy prey for Allied direct finding equipment. The Germans, for the first time in the war, found themselves at a communications disadvantage so severe it threatened their ability to fight at all. By the time the Hurtgen battles ended, German communications officers had reached a grim conclusion. The Americans were not merely outgunning them, they were out-communicating them. And a modern army that cannot communicate is an army already defeated.
Long before German commanders understood how deeply American communication superiority was shaping the battlefield, their own signals officers saw the disaster unfolding with painful clarity. At every level of the Wehrmacht, company, battalion, regiment, even corps, the tactical network they depended on was slowly collapsing under the strain of a radio technology that simply could not keep pace with the demands of modern mechanized war. Meanwhile, American forces strode into combat carrying a device that did not look dangerous at all, a 35-pound backpack with a long antenna, known officially as the SCR-300. To the U.S. Army, it was a breakthrough. To the Germans who faced it, it would become a nightmare. The SCR-300 was the world's first practical FM man-portable radio, and it changed everything. Where German AM sets produced static, fading, distortion, and interference, the SCR-300 delivered clean, stable voice communication across ranges of 3 to 8 miles, even through forests, hills, and urban rubble. And where German sets were notoriously vulnerable to atmospheric noise, Allied jamming, or unintended cross-frequency bleeding, the SCR-300 remained clear under nearly all battlefield conditions thanks to frequency modulation and its built-in squelch circuit that muted background noise entirely. In practical terms, this meant American platoons, pinned by machine gun fire, could call artillery within seconds. It meant that company commanders could maneuver under fire without losing contact. It meant that tank infantry teams could coordinate assaults even when separated by terrain. And it meant that German units, accustomed to exploiting moments of confusion, now faced an enemy who could recover far too quickly for those tactics to work. German communications officers had no answer. Their standard infantry radios, such as the Tornfu-D2, Tornfu-B1, and Feldfu series, relied on AM transmission and were far more fragile, far more power-hungry, and dramatically less reliable in complex terrain. Even in ideal conditions, German radios achieved nowhere near the operational clarity of the SCR-300. In Normandy's bocage, France's stone villages, or the Hurtgen forest's choking dark, their performance collapsed. AM signals bounced, dissolved, or vanished entirely. Tanks lost contact with infantry. Battalion HQ lost contact with companies. Requests for support disappeared into the ether. And when a message did get through, it often arrived distorted or incomplete, forcing commanders to repeat transmissions and risk detection by Allied intercept units. Meanwhile, American signal traffic moved effortlessly. U.S. commanders could leapfrog units, adjust their plans on the fly, and coordinate multi-axis assaults in real time. It was not glamorous, and it rarely appeared in war movies, but communications, not tanks, not aircraft, was the glue that made the U.S. Army a coherent, flexible, lethal machine. The Germans began noticing something else, something even more unsettling. The SCR-300 did not merely survive battlefield conditions, it thrived in them. Rain, fog, thunderstorms, smoke, none of it mattered. FM transmission ignored the atmospheric disturbances that crippled AM signals. Even artillery concussions, which often shook tubes and crystals loose inside German radios, failed to interrupt U.S. communications. And because of the SCR-300's superior signal-to-noise ratio, American units could speak quietly and still be heard clearly, drastically reducing the risk of enemy detection. The consequences were devastating. At Mortain, German officers repeatedly attempted to adjust their attacks, coordinate with supporting infantry, and redirect Panther companies toward weaknesses in the American line. But without dependable radios, these attempts dissolved before they could influence the battle. Orders that should have reached the front in minutes took hours or never arrived at all. One German major compared the experience to fighting with our eyes closed and our mouths sewn shut. In the Hürtgen forest, the situation became even more dire. German AM sets simply could not penetrate the dense canopy or rugged terrain. As a result, company commanders sometimes had no idea where their neighboring units were. Patrols became lost. Reserves were committed blindly. Artillery batteries fired without accurate observation. And when U.S. forces launched localized assaults or feints, German units could not coordinate counterattacks because their radios had fallen silent at the moment they needed them the most. Meanwhile, American SCR-300 networks hummed with traffic, requests for smoke, corrections for artillery, progress reports, casualty updates, and calls for armor support. Even when the fighting turned into a close-range, mud-soaked nightmare, American command and control remained intact. German POWs later remarked that they believed the Americans always knew where we were, always knew where they were, and always could bring fire on us. The SCR-300 created that illusion of omniscience, and in many ways, it wasn't an illusion at all. Every platoon became a node in a broader battlefield web. Every company had real-time awareness. Every battalion commander had a responsive instrument of coordination the Wehrmacht lacked entirely. In essence, the SCR-300 transformed American infantry from isolated pockets into an interconnected organism. For German communications officers, proud inheritors of a tradition that emphasized technical excellence, the humiliation was profound. They were not merely being outsignaled, they were being rendered irrelevant. Their carefully trained radio operators, struggling with fragile equipment, watched enemy FM networks operate with the ease and reliability of civilian telephone systems. Their commanders, desperate for updated intelligence or battle reports, stared at silent sets while artillery thundered outside. And when their radios did work, they faced even a greater threat: American signal intercept units that homed in on AM transmissions with frightening precision. By the end of 1944, German signal officers understood the scale of their disadvantage. The Americans had not just brought better radios, they had brought a communications doctrine that weaponized clarity, speed, and coordination. The Wehrmacht had entered the war believing in movement, flexibility, and rapid concentration of force. But now they faced an enemy who could adapt faster, communicate faster, and strike faster, not through superior tactics alone, but because they could talk to each other when it mattered the most. The SCR-300 was not just a radio. It was the backbone of a new kind of warfare, one where battles weren't won by the loudest guns or the heaviest armor, but by the army that could share information the fastest. And in that world, Germany's fate was sealed The moment the first American radio man keyed his handset and spoke words the enemy could never clearly hear. Fire mission over.
Before dawn on August 7, 1944, when Hitler's counterattack at Mortain, Operation Ludic, opened with the growl of Panther engines and the grinding advance of SS armored columns, German commanders believed they finally had a chance to reverse the collapse in Normandy. If they could break through the American line and reach Avranches, they might sever Patton's supply lifeline, trap U.S. forces in Brittany, and buy Germany weeks, perhaps months, of additional resistance. But the men who understood the truth first were not tank commanders or infantry officers. They were German signal troops. Long before the first Panthers reached Hill 314, the German communications network was already coming apart. The moment the attack entered the bocage, AM radios began to fade. Critical messages dissolved into static. Platoons lost contact with their companies. Command posts tried desperately to coordinate an offensive that depended on speed, timing, and synchronized thrusts from multiple units. Instead, they found themselves broadcasting into silence. For the Americans, the battle began differently. At outposts along the 30th Infantry Division's front line, SCR 300 radios came alive instantly. Clear FM transmissions relayed the first signs of German armor: engine noise, movement in the hedgerows, flashes of tank guns, and within minutes, U.S. commanders at battalion and regimental headquarters had a coherent picture of the entire German assault axis. The contrast was staggering. While German units were marching forward half-blind, U.S. units were talking, mapping, adjusting, and preparing. By 05 o'clock, German Panthers had broken through several American positions, but the breakthrough was already faltering for reasons invisible to the tank crews pushing forward. The 2nd SS Panzer Division could not reach the 116th Panzer Division because their signal nets had collapsed. Assault units called for supporting artillery and received no answer. Kampfgruppe Wünsche advanced without knowing that Kampfgruppe Frey had been delayed. A Tiger commander later told interrogators that the attack felt like pushing into fog, not because of terrain, but because we had no idea where anyone was. Meanwhile, American FDCs, Fire Direction Centers, were receiving fire missions through SCR 300 sets faster than they could process them. Forward observers on Hill 314 used FM radios to correct artillery in real time. The first German columns to seize parts of Mortain town found themselves caught in a sudden and extremely accurate curtain of US 105mm fire. Not one of those fire missions was delayed due to communications failure. In fact, the speed and clarity of the radio traffic allowed the 30th Infantry Division's artillery to fire more than 12,000 rounds in the first day alone, creating a defensive wall the Germans never breached. German officers soon found themselves in a nightmare of disconnection. Panzer Grenadiers advancing on Hill 314 could not call for artillery because their AM sets could not cut through the terrain. SS radio operators tilted long antennas into the sky and repositioned themselves on ridgelines, but the moment they stepped into cover, the signal vanished again. Orders to bypass Mortain and press westward towards Avranches took hours to reach some units. Others never received them. Mortain was supposed to be a lightning strike. Instead, it became a fragmented, uncoordinated push in which isolated German formations attacked at different times against a defender who knew exactly where every attack was coming from. The most dramatic demonstration of this communications asymmetry came from Hill 314, where roughly 700 men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, held out against multiple SS assaults. The hill should have fallen quickly. It had little cover, limited ammunition, and no immediate reinforcements. But the SCR 300 allowed the surrounded battalion to coordinate artillery fire with almost supernatural precision. Foe teams called in strikes on German tanks within 100 yards of their perimeter. Mortar sections fired blind but adjusted instantly based on radio corrections. Every German attempt to mass forces for a decisive push broke apart under the weight of perfectly timed American barrages. German commanders were baffled. Their maps told them Hill 314 was isolated. Their scouts reported U.S. troops were low on ammunition. Yet every time the Germans attempted to seize the hill, American fire landed as if guided by an all-seeing eye. That eye was the FM network, unbreakable, uninterfered with, and constantly updating. By midday on August 7, the battle's momentum had shifted completely. U.S. reinforcements, coordinated by radio, began counterattacking. German units, still unable to restore communications, misinterpreted American movement as larger than expected forces. Some withdrew prematurely. Others pressed forward without support into kill zones defined by American artillery. The decisive moment came when the 2nd SS Panzer Division attempted a final thrust towards Avranches. Their lead elements never received the order. Their supporting battalion never learned the attack had begun. Their artillery never fired. In the aftermath, captured German signals officers admitted something stunning. The attack at Mortain did not fail because the Americans were stronger or more numerous. It failed because the Americans could coordinate and the Germans could not. Mortain was the first time many in the Wehrmacht understood that the U.S. had gained an overwhelming advantage not through tanks or aircraft, but through the invisible architecture of battlefield communication. Mortain was supposed to reopen the war for Germany. Instead, it revealed that the war had entered a new phase, one in which an army that could not talk could not win. And on August 7, 1944, Germany discovered that its radios, not its tanks, had doomed the offensive before the first shot was fired.
The Hürtgen Forest was not a battlefield. It was a punishment. A tangled, wet, sunless maze of pines stretching along the German border, it swallowed entire divisions whole. Rainwater pooled in shell craters. Fog drifted low across the forest floor. Every hill blocked visibility. Every ravine trapped sound. But the worst killer was something no map showed. The forest devoured radio signals. When the U.S. Army entered Hürtgen in September 1944, they brought a weapon that proved almost immune to the forest's suffocating grasp: the SCR-300 FM radio. German forces marched in with AM sets that struggled even on open plains. In Hürtgen's choking terrain, they failed catastrophically. For German communications officers, Hürtgen was the nightmare Mortain had hinted at: a battlefield where their entire tactical network simply stopped functioning. German infantry units entering the forest quickly realized they were fighting without their most basic tool: reliable contact with higher command. The Tonfu D2 and Tonfu B1 radios, which depended on amplitude modulation and required relatively clean line of sight to maintain clarity, failed within minutes of leaving the forest roads. Signals scattered off wet leaves, soaked bark, and uneven ground. Messages that should have taken seconds never arrived. Patrols sent out to probe American lines disappeared into the trees and failed to report back, not because they were destroyed, but because their radios were useless. Company commanders strained to hear fractured voices buried under static, often giving up entirely and relying on runners who were frequently killed in the attempt to cross just a few hundred yards of ground. On paper, Hürtgen should have been a defender's paradise for Germany. The forest nullified American armor, limited air support, and turned every hill into a fortress. Yet German officers soon discovered they were also blind inside their own stronghold. When American units probed defenses, defenders could not warn neighboring positions. When U.S. forces shifted to exploit a gap, German battalions learned of the breach far too late to seal it. When American artillery began its habitual pounding, German observers struggled to send back coordinates. And when local commanders attempted counterattacks, their units rarely arrived at the same place or time. The forest didn't just weaken German radio, it shredded the very concept of coordinated defense. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army's SCR-300 behaved as if operating in a different reality. The FM signal ignored most of the atmospheric noise that crippled AM sets. It cut through fog and damp air. It didn't fade with each tree line. American platoons could speak clearly to their company CPs. Battalion commanders could contact artillery. Forward observers, who were the single most important asset in the Hürtgen, could give real-time adjustments even when surrounded by dense foliage. At a time when entire German units fought without knowing the positions of their own comrades, American observers used their dependable radios to call strikes within 50 yards of frontline infantry. German POWs later marveled at the experience, recalling how American artillery would adjust fire as if they were watching us through the trees. In a sense, they were, not with eyes, but with radios. The consequences rippled through every level of the battle. American units took heavy casualties, but they maintained coordination. When a platoon became pinned, the SCR-300 brought mortars or 105mm artillery within minutes. When a patrol stumbled upon a bunker, they could call armor or engineers to break it. When battalions began to falter under fire, regimental command could instantly redirect reserves. German forces, by contrast, experienced paralysis. Units reported receiving their first clear radio transmission after days of fighting, often a retreat order. Even elite Fallschirmjäger regiments found themselves fighting blind and alone. Their commanders forced to decide attacks or withdrawals based on intuition rather than updated situational awareness. One incident captured the entire disparity. In mid-November, a US company near Gameter was surrounded by German forces during a brutal counterattack. The canopy overhead was so thick that daylight barely reached the ground, but the company's radio man raised his SCR-300 antenna and made contact on the first try. Within minutes, artillery from 3 battalions blanketed the German assault and broke it. A German signals officer captured shortly afterwards shook his head when interrogators asked why their own units had not coordinated similar support. He said, "We could not speak. The forest would not let us." The longer the battle dragged on, the more German commanders realized the truth. They were losing not because they lacked courage, weapons, or fortifications, but because the US Army could still communicate. Their own system, designed for speed and fluidity in open country blitzkrieg, had become useless in the very terrain where they needed it most. Even worse, German reliance on AM allowed American signal interception units to listen, triangulate, and exploit the few transmissions that did break through. The Americans rarely worried about their FM signals being intercepted. The Germans simply lacked the equipment to do so. By December 1944, as exhausted units withdrew from the forest, German communications officers submitted grim reports. One stated, "We are unable to maintain tactical control in wooded terrain against the Americans." Another warned that our radios cannot match their equipment, especially not in this environment. These were not excuses. They were acknowledgments of a battlefield truth Germany could no longer conceal. The US Army's radio network had turned one of the most inhospitable terrains in Europe into a battlefield they could still dominate. Hurtgen revealed the future of warfare just as clearly as Normandy had. Armies no longer won battles through tanks alone or infantry alone, but through the invisible web of connection that allowed them to act as a single organism. In the forest, where German radios died, the SCR-300 kept beating like a heart, and it pumped the lifeblood of coordination, artillery, and control into every American unit that fought there. Germany entered the Hurtgen believing terrain would slow the Americans. It did not. It did not expect the Americans to bring a communication system immune to that terrain. And as the surviving communications officers understood with bitter clarity, a modern army without reliable radios is not an army. It is a collection of isolated pockets waiting to be destroyed.
By late 1944, German signal officers no longer feared only the silence of their own radios. They feared the Americans who could hear them even when they did manage to transmit. The collapse of German AM communications at Mortain and Hurtgen had already crippled operational coordination, but something even more demoralizing was happening behind the scenes. Whenever a German radio did break through terrain and interference long enough to send a message, U.S. signal intercept units were often the first to hear it. And unlike the Wehrmacht, which struggled to decipher Allied FM networks, the Americans could not only intercept German transmissions, they could locate them with frightening accuracy. In essence, the more Germany relied on its radios, the more it exposed itself. U.S. direction-finding teams, part of the Signal Intelligence Service and the 3250th Signal Service Company, were scattered across the Western Front in small mobile detachments equipped with intercept receivers, loop antennas, and portable HF and VHF analyzers. Their job was simple: listen for German AM traffic, record it, triangulate it, and feed the intelligence to Corps and Army-level headquarters. But the impact was anything but simple. Each German transmission became a breadcrumb, revealing unit positions, strength, and intent. And because German AM radios were inherently leaky, producing detectable emissions even when not transmitting, American listening posts could sometimes map a battalion's location just by scanning for carrier waves. For German signals officers trained in the rigid doctrine of Nachrichtenwesen, this was nothing short of horror. They were already battling failing radios, vanishing signals, terrain that swallowed transmissions whole. Now they faced an adversary that could turn any successful broadcast into a vulnerability. At Mortain, before some German units even received their own orders, American intercept units had already captured those same orders and passed them to the 30th Infantry Division. During one crucial moment on August 7th, an intercepted German transmission revealed that the 2nd SS Panzer Division intended to bypass Hill 314 and drive toward Avranches. The message helped shape the Americans' defensive response long before the German units reached their start line. The same phenomenon appeared in the Hürtgen Forest, where American units often understood German troop shifts faster than the Germans themselves. Even when German transmissions lasted only a few seconds, just enough to report ammunition shortages or request reinforcements, the U.S. direction-finding network triangulated their origin. Artillery then turned those coordinates into smoking craters. German forward observers learned this lesson brutally. The moment they radioed in adjustments, American counter-battery fire followed within minutes. The SCR-300 added another layer of asymmetry. Because FM radios had short-range, line-of-sight signals with minimal unintended radiation, they were extremely difficult for German equipment to detect or interpret. The Wehrmacht had no FM intercept gear capable of decoding American tactical traffic in real time. What German listeners heard, if they heard anything at all, were faint bursts of ineligible FM static, meaningless without the right demodulation equipment. The American battlefield conversations that mattered most, platoon to company coordination, artillery spotting, maneuver commands, were effectively invisible. While German AM transmissions lit up the American intercept boards like beacons, U.S. FM transmissions were ghosts. This asymmetry produced something the German High Command never anticipated: a communications war Germany could not participate in. They could not silence American radios, they could not jam them, they could not intercept them, and they could not prevent their own signals from being captured. The very tool that had once enabled blitzkrieg, the rapid flow of tactical orders, now exposed German formations to American intelligence. Worse, the Americans streamlined the process. Intercept teams forwarded transcripts to traffic analysts. Analysts prioritized messages and flagged patterns. Corps commanders used those patterns to anticipate German counterattacks, withdrawals, or resupply movements. In the Ardennes, when the Battle of the Bulge began, German radio discipline was unusually tight. Hitler demanded radio silence before the offensive, but the moment the offensive bogged down, units began transmitting out of necessity. Within hours, American intercept teams identified the divisions involved and their axes of advance. By the third day, U.S. artillery had accurate maps of German headquarters locations, all courtesy of intercepted AM reports. German communications officers could only watch helplessly as their most essential tool became a liability. The psychological toll was enormous. Wehrmacht units entering combat in late 1944 and 1945 were instructed to avoid transmitting on AM sets whenever possible. Many resorted to runners, field telephones, or visual signals, the very techniques blitzkrieg had rendered obsolete. Meanwhile, American forces leaned more heavily on their FM radios than ever before. The more chaotic the battlefield became, the more the SCR-300 proved its worth. German officers interviewed after the war recalled an unnerving pattern. Whenever they transmitted, American artillery came soon after. One signals lieutenant from the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division put it bluntly, "Our radios connected us to our own generals, but also to the American guns." By spring 1945, the German communication system was effectively broken. American advances moved too quickly for damaged or outdated AM equipment to keep up. Replacement radios were scarce, batteries were scarce, trained operators were scarce, and at every moment, American intercept units listened, mapped, and exploited whatever traffic still existed. The Wehrmacht's once proud signals corps that had guided Panzer breakthroughs from Poland to Crete to the Caucasus ended the war reduced to short, desperate transmissions, each one a beacon for Allied fire. The final irony was one German officers admitted bitterly after the surrender. Their radios, designed to make war faster, now made defeat faster. The Americans had not simply built a better radio. They had built an ecosystem of communication, FM networks, intercept teams, coordinated artillery, mobile headquarters that Germany could neither match nor evade. In modern mechanized warfare, information is as lethal as firepower. Mortain proved it. Hurtgen proved it. The Bulge proved it. The war ended with Germany's radios still crackling in the ruins of its cities. But by then, everyone in the Wehrmacht understood the truth. They had not been outmaneuvered. They had been outcommunicated. And in the end, an army that cannot speak cannot survive.